Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, Ministers, Ambassadors, Muftis, Bishops, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning and welcome you all to the royal session here. We have with us three top-notch, wonderful lawyers in the world, and indeed in the presence of, I believe, 9 muftis from Malaysia, with bishops mingled together, and indeed ambassadors from across the world, in an amazing auditorium here. And if it is not because of the name Azman Hashim, I think, you can see the logo A brings to mind. In fact, for those of us who watch Star Trek, The Next Generation, you would think that this is the USS Enterprise. And indeed, in the spirit of to boldly go where no one actually has gone before, and with the wonderful speech given by His Royal Highnesses just now, and I think we're very lucky to be here this morning, in fact. And I'd like to, in fact, start off, gentlemen. This is something which, beginning, when we talk about human dignity, and we've heard what His Royal Highness said about how the concept and the nature of dignity really, it was born from a moral, religious idea. And none of you here are theologians. I'm the only one, in that field. You are all, great lawyers in your field. And I have to say that when I'm asked about this, I always think of the example of the case in the Islamic tradition. One very famous theologian, his name was Fakhruddin Razi. He's a bit like the Duns Scotus of the Muslim world, the Doctor Subtilis. And he said something like this, that the human being can be either better than angels or worse than the devil. And it's an amazing statement. This is something where you could be better than angels when you become true to yourself, true to your human dignity. Or if you let down your human dignity, you can be worse than animals, because you will be like the devils in that sense. So the stories that His Royal has given us, in fact, are good examples where it is really all up to what we do and what we not only just say, but precisely what we do. So here I'd like to begin really this discussion. And gents, this is going to be Davos style, so I hope none of you have prepared anything. No PowerPoint presentations. We're going to have, frank conversations. And I'm going to be introducing each and one of you, and we'll have, sort of a lead question of 10 minutes each. And then we'll really have an open conversation, and please interrupt each other. So for those of you who watch either NBC or CNN, it's like the McLaughlin Group, and we expect that since you all come from all over the world and you're used to that. So we'll start off with our first panelist, Professor Brett Scharffs, who's obviously, your credentials, you're the director of the prestigious International Center for Law and Religious Studies. This is a center that combines both the legal tradition, but also in my field, religious studies. And I've discovered last week that when you spent time with us in Oxford, you yourself, you're an Oxford man and you're a Rhodes Scholar. So we are only Clarendon on our side, so different colors there. But Brett then, after studied law in Oxford, then went to Yale to do his JD, to get his JD, and now you're the director of this Center for Law and Religious Studies in BYU Law, and that's one of the most famous law schools in the United States. So Brett, your center has been focusing your work on human dignity, at least I've noticed for the last 5 years. Could you tell us, how this began and why, particularly in the context of His Royal Highness's royal keynote just now, why is this so important, Brett?
Well, in the spirit of His Royal Highness's talk, I'm going to begin with a story. And it was in January of 2018, and Jan Figel, who was the EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU, that's a mouthful, was visiting, and we were talking about what we might do to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he told a story that completely shifted our discussion and indeed the next 5 years of my life. He was on the phone with a minister from Pakistan, and the conversation went something like this. Hello, this is Jan Fagel, EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside the EU. I'd like to come visit. And he said, can you imagine the response I got? He said, well, first, there was a long silence. And then there was a deep sucking of air. And then there was a very suspicious, what do you want to talk about? And he said, well, I'd like to come and talk about human dignity and how it's important for all people at all times in all places. And he said there was another silence, much shorter and broken with a different tone of voice. Ah, karama, human dignity. This is an important concept in our holy book, the Quran. Why don't you come and we can talk? And so he did. And meeting led to meeting, and over time they became more trustful and more candid. And in the end, he was one of the people who was able to successfully negotiate the release of a Christian woman, Asia Bibi, who had been convicted of blasphemy for drinking out of a container of water that was shared with Muslim women. And as we heard this story, we realized that human dignity had a unique capacity for reaching across divides, for opening doors, and starting conversations. And so in 2018, we held 3 conferences focusing on different aspects of human dignity. The first at Central European University in Budapest, talking about how human dignity emerged from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the role that it played. Secondly, about the many uses of human dignity. This conference was held at Oxford University. And at that conference, the metaphor of a Swiss Army knife came to the forefront of thinking of one tool with many uses. And then at our center in October that year, we held a conference on the connections between human dignity and religious freedom. And all of this culminated in a conference held at Punta del Este, Uruguay, where the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere was adopted. And for the last 5 years, we've been trying to amplify and develop the message of human dignity. And we've tried to do this primarily by amplifying voices that those of us in the West don't typically listen to. And so just last year, we held a conference on Asian perspectives on human dignity. This was at BYU Hawaii, and we have some of the organizers of that conference here with us today. And then here in Malaysia and also in Qatar, we held conferences on Islamic perspectives on human dignity. And then in Côte d'Ivoire, in Africa, we held a conference on African perspectives on human dignity. And the African book was actually completed on December 10th, 2023, which, for those of you who are human rights junkies, will know was the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the UDHR. And we launched that book at a conference in Zimbabwe in May of this year. We also released this year a book published by Routledge on judicial uses of human dignity. And so what we're hoping is that we can generate momentum towards an effort to convince the United Nations General Assembly to adopt an annual day, Human Dignity Day, that will correspond with Human Rights Day, and that these two together can serve the objective articulated in the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to keep these concepts at the forefront of our minds, because we must be constantly reminded of human dignity, of human rights, of freedom of religion and belief, if they're going to be realized in our daily lives.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we next have Professor Cole Durham, who's the president of the G20 Interfaith Forum. Cole, I'd like to start by asking you, in fact, again, like with Brad, you know, how would human dignity be of relevance, particularly your work at the G20? And if I may, given that you're now in Malaysia and given His Royal Highness's speech just now, Malaysia is not a member, you know, of the G20. And how would people here be able to contribute, you know, to that forum? So if you may, please, thank you.
Okay, well,
it is on.
it is on. One of the things you learn with these microphones is you have to become a rock star and hold the microphone right in front of your, and I have to confess I'm not a rock star. But let me just say a few things about the G20 and how it connects with dignity. The G20 consists, as its name suggests, a little deceptively, of 20 major economic powerhouses on Earth. So this is the 19 countries plus the EU. But in addition, about a year ago, we actually suggested this, but I think it was more because of Biden and Modi that it happened. The African Union became a member like the EU. Right. But that added about another 50, I don't know exactly, about another 50 countries. So the G20 is a little bit of an underestimate of the number of countries. But one of the things that's happened is that there are many things that happen at the United Nations, which is, of course, is the truly global body. But there sometimes, you may have noticed that the UN can be inefficient. And the idea of the G20, which is informal, doesn't even have a secretariat. It sort of goes from year to year. But it does include countries that include, well, before Africa, it was at least 80% of the economics on Earth. I'm not sure how much Africa added, less than what we might think, unfortunately. But the G20 has become a very important place where global policy is made. Now, it's clear, particularly since the crash in 2008, what the G20 has been about is fundamentally about economics. And a lot of the work of the G20 focuses on trying to avoid future crashes like 2008. But what we've noticed over the past decade as I've been involved with the G20 is that each successive G20 country chooses its own priorities, things that stand out, and virtually always, in addition to the economic issues, there are issues that line up with things like the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, other humanitarian goals, and at their core, various ways of protecting human dignity. Right. And so I think one of my efforts as president of this organization, but more as a sort of someone who's able to work with leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, academic leaders, because of the importance of the G20 in terms of global impact, this is a platform that people understand. And we have been able to invite people from many other countries, I told His Highness this morning we'd love to invite him to the G20, but others from Malaysia as well. Each year, the G20 host can invite other countries to participate. And the reality is, we find that as we work globally, we have opportunities to work on many of these issues. Now, I remember an interesting example of, I remember walking into the World Council of Churches offices in Geneva one day, and they had a little altar. It was sort of an altar to the Sustainable Development Goals. This may sound a little strange, except it lined up with a very famous Christian passage from the New Testament. And I'm not going to be able to quote this exactly correctly, but it basically says, when did we see you, the Lord? When you dealt with the hungry, or when you dealt with those who were needing clothing or had health problems and so forth. And I'm not doing this exactly, but what was interesting was that this little altar lined up with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but it lined up with basic Christian doctrines. But it was not just Christian doctrines. You would recognize these as Muslim doctrines. I mean, what's clear when you're working in this kind of area is that the religious communities have cared about some of these fundamental issues longer than there have been nation states. And behind these concepts, these religious concepts, religious concerns, is really the concept of dignity. Now, we don't always call it that, but think of how we shore up human dignity. And let me just tick off some of the Sustainable Development Goals. Eliminating poverty, zero hunger, promoting health care. I've heard, and I've also heard this figure disputed, but that something like a third of health care on earth is provided by religious institutions. And the religious institutions are actually better at this in the countryside than some of the major public institutions. So think of education, think of empowering women, think of some of the major environmental issues of our time, solving the climate crisis, water. Now, these are, I mean, if you thought of the sort of human rights, you would think of some of the social and economic and cultural rights. But these are also about dignity in very profound and significant ways. So we have working groups that deal with trafficking, with hunger, with health, with coming out of the COVID crisis, with I could go on, but this is one of the ways that we really wrestle with human dignity. Now, in some ways, at the G20 level, you're looking at things from the top, but religious communities are uniquely strong at getting the concerns all the way down to the grassroots, to getting the water, as it will, to go to the end of the row, and so that you really have the kind of impact. And one of the tragic things is all too often religious voices are not heard at the table. I've heard it said that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This is something we're trying to avoid. We're trying to get religious voices, their kind of long-term concerns with dignity, with these practical issues, to really have an impact globally.
Thank you, Cole. And I have an intervention here from Brad.
Yes, just to put it even a little more directly than Cole did.
I'm always a little abstract.
It's all right. So the religious communities call are not the victims on the table, you see. So
The minute the Sustainable Development Goals were drafted, they were destined to fail. And they will fail. And the primary reason they will fail is because there's no mention whatsoever of religion in the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is zero chance of accomplishing those goals without the participation, the cooperation, the partnership, not the instrumentalization, but the genuine listening and partnership of religious organizations.
Right.
And that is what the IF20 is trying to bring to the table.
Yeah, I think I can just add to that. The problem is that too many people think of the G20 as just a place where global leaders go to pontificate and sign off on a communique or something like that. But the real impact that I've seen is people being attracted by the platform, coming together and finding concrete ways to set priorities and to actually do things. And that is what religious communities are good at. And we need to find ways, effective ways that religious communities can effectively partner with government and other leaders, and that they can share their insight and wisdom, and that it can be contribute in ways that will communicate to economists and other technical people, but that will actually get all the way down to the grassroots.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm thanks to Cole for his intervention there. Indeed, thank you. And our third panelist this morning is Mr. Mark Hill, KC. Now, for those of you who might not know what KC is, indeed, it's because of the change of monarch in the United Kingdom from Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II to now His Majesty Charles III. This is the convention in Britain where the Queen Council formally has become the King Council, hence KC. And Mark over dinner last night was just saying, there should be a T-shirt perhaps printed, KC in KL. I mean, but it's just a thought in the presence of His Royal Highness, particularly given the patronage of the palace in a country like the United Kingdom with the third estate. And it's interesting that when you become a senior lawyer, we have the Bar Association here, of course, in Malaysia, just as in the UK. And perhaps we should be thinking in Malaysia, sort of an SC or something, Sultan's Council, something like that here in Malaysia. Because, when you do become a senior lawyer, this is part of that recognition, a senior advocate. And as Mark is, of course, you've been operating in the World Court, from the Supreme Court in the UK to the European courts, the ICJ and the rest, etc., etc. But what I like to, if I may, Mark, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here. And see where you can stand the test of trial in this case. I know that you've been working very hard in persuading the United Nations to adopt, as Brad mentioned earlier, a UN Human Dignity Day. Given there are already, I think many days already in the UN calendar. I can think of a couple. There's, I looked it up this morning. There's the UN, Radio Day. There's a Radio Day. There is a World Seagrass Day. There's even one World Tourism Resilience Day. What has tourism have to do with resilience? I'm not going to ask you that. But of course, you even, of course, have the famous UN Human Rights Day, which is on the 10th of December. But what would adding a UN Human Dignity Day, make any difference? I mean, especially now we have too many UN days. So, as the great advocate from Britain, I'd like to hear your case. I'm not the judge, but I'm the other devil's advocate, to hear your defense of this. Why have you worked so hard to persuade the UN to have yet another day on their calendar? Mark, please.
Well, I wasn't expecting to come here and have the tables turned on me by such rigorous cross-examination. But I will do the best I can as an independent witness to withstand this harsh advocate I'm facing.
Here.
What we're not saying is by dedicating one day of the year to human dignity, we ignore it for the other 364. That's far from the ambition, because it's abundantly plain that human dignity is something which strikes at the very core of the human. It's something that we live with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and throughout the year. So those who say it's merely symbolic to create another day are missing the point entirely. Life is rich with symbols. Symbols carry meaning, a far deeper meaning than they might in other ways. And what lies behind our desire to dedicate one day of the year when the public at large can reflect upon human dignity is because it keeps it constantly in the forefront of our thinking and in the forefront of our priorities. Not just at a high-level governmental way of thinking, but at a much lower level, grassroots way of thinking, in places of worship, in the family home, but most especially in schools and other places of education. Because this is a long-term goal. The goal is to create educational materials which can be linked to Human Dignity Day, whereby in classrooms of every school throughout the world, the next generation who are going to be responsible for world peace, world security, and all else that runs with that, will be made fully aware that human dignity is a priority. Now, I've been teased by the fact I'm a lawyer, and by the fact I'm a human rights lawyer in particular. Human rights are a wonderful thing. They were created in a formal way under the Universal Declaration, as we've heard, in 1948. But like anybody who's reached the grand old age of 75, they get a bit tired and lethargic, and they need to be reinvigorated. And what we have behind our thinking with human dignity is not to supplant or replace human rights, but to augment it with a fresh way of thinking, a fresh way of dialogue, and a fresh way of interrelating one with another. Because there is one underlying problem about human rights. Rights are by their nature asserting oppositional difference between the citizen and the state, or between one citizen and another citizen. Rights are realized through litigation in courts and other tribunals. And the very nature of litigation is that it has a winner and a loser. One side always loses out when human rights are asserted and matters are taken to court. The distinction and the new way of thinking with human dignity is that there can be no losers. Everybody benefits by the assertion of human dignity, because as the title of this conference makes abundantly plain, it's human dignity for everyone, everywhere. Properly construed, properly interpreted, properly appreciated, human dignity makes us all winners. And let me say a little bit about the progress so far in relation to United Nations Human Dignity Day. A year ago, we had a hugely successful conference. All good things start in Oxford, and that's where our conference met. A huge amount of international goodwill. And we're building a small coalition of countries that will be in the forefront of pushing the matter forward at a universal human rights level. Firstly, we've done so through contacts in Geneva, where the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights is based. But now the momentum has moved to New York. To New York, which is the structural base of the United Nations organization. And what we need to have is a core of nations who are committed to the promotion of the United Nations Human Dignity Day, not as an end in itself, but as a means to promoting thinking and action on human dignity the world over. And having heard His Royal Highness the Sultan speak this morning with such energy and such passion and such commitment to human dignity as a vital force within civil society, nothing would give me more pleasure than for Malaysia to be in the forefront of that core team of nations, pushing within the UN situation to bring this dream into reality, to make the United Nations Human Dignity Day a reality for everyone throughout the globe. And I hope that message can be carried home.
Well, you know, really, your robust defensive position is unassailable, particularly once you've cited His Royal Highness. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to open up, in fact, for questions, and also from the floor. And I think this is really a wonderful occasion, the opportunity for us to particularly engage. So I've been made to understand that the organizers have microphones on this side as well as that side, to that. But while we wait for a show of hands, in fact, I'd like to ask, particularly now with the three of you, and we, as I said, this is free flowing. Please interrupt whenever. Given what Mark has said just now, I mean, what are the main challenges of, in this case, the human dignity project in the face of the language of human rights today? I mean, it's a very well-established tradition by now. I mean, there are challenges clearly, and I thought maybe Brad, Cole, Mark. I mean, you come in on that. It's
So, Your Royal Highness, allow me to share a story.
Yet another story. Very good, yes.
When the drafting committee was comprised in 1946 and 47 to begin the drafting of the UDHR, there were 18 countries represented. And it was very representative of the world at that time. There were only a little less than 60 countries in the United Nations. And you can't draft a document with 18 people around the table. So they created a drafting committee made up of 4. Right. And the drafting committee of 4 could not draft a document. It was too controversial. And so they asked the secretary, John Humphreys, to create a draft. And he did. And it was 480 pages long. Now, those of you who are familiar with the UDHR, it's 30 brief articles that you can print on one side of one piece of paper. How did we get from 480 pages to 1 page? The answer is human dignity. When the process ground to a halt, it was the Chinese delegate, P.C. Cheng, who said, recall the preamble to the United Nations Charter. It speaks of human dignity as being the foundation of human rights. Right. And with that, the logjam was broken, and the drafting process became much more constructive. And if you look at the first paragraph of the preamble to the UDHR, the first thing you will find is a reference to human dignity. And if you look at the first sentence of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first thing you will find is human dignity. Human dignity and human rights are different sides of the same coin. They can't be separated one from another. There's no desire to replace the human rights architecture. We have human rights institutions, we have human rights councils, we have human rights committees. But my fear is that human rights is a little bit like a big, beautiful, high church cathedral with no one in the pews. And what human dignity has the chance of doing in our divisive, politicized, polarized world is to play a role similar to the role that it played in 1947 and 1948, generating consensus and agreement that resulted in a document that on a rainy night in Paris, on December 10th, 1948, was adopted unanimously by the countries of the world. And so human dignity, we think, needs to play a role in our political moment that is in some ways analogous to the role that human dignity played when the cold winds of the Cold War were really about to place the world into a deep freeze.
So maybe I could pick up on a word that Brett mentioned, and that is polarization. I think if there is one factor going on in the world that we're living in that is standing in the way of a lot of positive things happening, it is the increasing polarization. This is political polarization, it's news media polarization. There are all kinds of forces that are pushing us further and further apart. When we really started thinking about what really started us thinking about things in the first place that led to the meeting with Jan Fiegel and so forth, was this problem of polarization and how we respond. And one of the things we realized is we needed we couldn't just sort of enter the trenches and enter the polarization slinging with everyone else. We needed to find some overarching concepts and some overarching things to do. So one of the really important things is that the idea of dignity is something, it's admittedly a concept that all kinds of forces in our world are trying to capture and mobilize, but there's something about it that if you are trying to work for dignity, you can't just work for your own dignity.
Right.
You have to work for other people's dignity as well. And at the same time, and let me jump from that to my work with the G20. This is what I find happening with the platform is everyone knows that there are multiple. Pluralism is a really understated word for the plurality of the religious world. But one of the things about the G20 that happens is we can bring people together and identify some priorities about which a lot of people agree, and that we can actually find ways and have the experience of religious communities so that they're not contributing to polarization, but there are some ways that they can work together and help come out of the polarization. And these are things that our world deeply needs.
Indeed. No, thank you, Cole. Mark, yes,
well,
your intervention.
I'd just like to add what I hope is a helpful analogy in that we talk about peace builders and those who are responsible for resolving disputes, and these people and institutions exist at every level of society, from the very lowest communitarian level right up to international organizations. And they have various means and methods of building peace and resolving conflict. What the concept of human dignity, as explained in the Punta del Este Declaration, can be, is an additional part of the toolkit used by those who are building peace and who are bridging divides in society in a way of bringing people together. Because as Cole has rightly said, it's not your own dignity that matters, it's the dignity of those you disagree with. And if a resolution can be found which acknowledges and maximizes the human dignity of every individual, then it's far more likely to lead to an enduring and lasting resolution than dealing with something in a purely legalistic way. Human dignity is not intended to supplant human rights. Mm-hmm. As Brett has said, they are born of the same mother, they are twins. They will always be interlocked and mutually supportive. But by changing the dialogue, by focusing on human dignity, I think together we can move mountains.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed. I thought now I saw a couple of show of hands there. Is it Tan Sri Azman? Oh, bring the microphone down, yes. That side. Tan Sri, you're not here. Yeah. There we go.
Actually, I was just trying to meditate like this. But since
this is it is providential question in this case. Welcome, Tan Sri.
Actually, I come from the world of finance. And as the distinguished speakers were speaking, and of course the royal address, on the subject of dignity, I can't help but reflect the issue of debt, actually. Mm. And I think when debt is overwhelming, I think it has an inverse relationship with dignity. Mm. Certainly from my tradition, the Islamic tradition, I believe there is a saying that I think the worst worry is the worry of debt. As we know, debt has gone astronomically high. I note, Brett, you did some work at Yale. I follow the work of the late David Graeber, who eloquently wrote the 5,000 years history of debt. It has now reached where the G20 and others, indeed G20 was formed from the mother of all debt explosions, the Lehman crisis of 2008. And I think an approach to human dignity, we need to reflect. It's all and well. I don't think any of us can argue about the karamah of human dignity. The issue is what is the obstacles, the kemungkaran, the munkar that sits between us and human dignity.
That's evil, by the way, munkar.
Munkar, the evil in between. And therefore, to us, and I believe Dato Afifi, it is not symmetrical. To do good and to remove an evil. To remove an evil is more meritorious because it blocks the doing, the thinking and the doing of good. And I would submit that one of the great meta blockers in our age today is indeed debt and the financial condition. Just wondering, eminent speakers, your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Cool.
So you've clearly put your finger on one of the huge problems. I would have to say in G20 settings, dealing with the debt crisis is probably one of the biggest priorities. And this is not to say that anyone has an instant answer. I think finance ministers of all the G20 countries are wrestling with this. And what people are particularly wrestling with is countries like a lot of African countries who are sort of need some kind of debt relief. I know we have a session coming up focused sort of by one of the leaders of the Jubilee movement in the United States, which is linked with the Vatican but other religious denominations. and a reminder that in some ways, sometimes we have to find ways of alleviating debt. And that's certainly one of the recurring voices coming from religious communities. But it is clearly one of the huge problems, and it's one that everyone is wrestling with and no one has total answers to.
And in the context, in case the audience is not familiar with the concept of a debt jubilee, it's really forgiving debt, I think, to take that out.
What I would add is that human dignity is not an algorithm that really helps us solve problems. What it is it's a source of illumination, which helps us get in a better mindset for solving problems. So whether it's the debt crisis, whether it's the treatment of refugees in refugee camps, whether it's what we do in prisons, whether it's how we run schools or hospitals, if we look at these problems through the lens of human dignity, it's going to help us focus our problem solving in a way that is going to be quite generative, just as it's helped solve the drafting of the UDHR. It wasn't a magic pill. It was sort of a lens and an illumination that made it possible to solve the problem.
And I think that's the genius of it, like in His Highness's speech. I mean, it's Adam's gift, and you go back to it whenever you kind of start getting lost in your ways in that respect, Brad. Yeah.
And one thing I love about that Muslim perspective, and I had never understood this until my Muslim friends explained it to me. In the Quran, dignity is a gift that God gives Adam and to all humankind. And what we do when we extend dignity to each other is we emulate God and try to extend the grace and the goodness to others that He has extended to us. And that idea of dignity as a gift is something we don't capture, for example, in Immanuel Kant's philosophy of dignity.
Thank you.
But
Mark.
when His Royal Highness was speaking, he spoke of the micro and the macro in relation to this. And it's not merely international debt that we need to look at. It's about the capacity of everyone to have the dignity of being able to earn a sufficient wage to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. Human dignity impacts at every single level of society.
Thank you. A dignitas in Latin, and having a dignified life. Now I see, we have an Oxford man here.
Thank you.
This is a BCL graduate from Oxford University, Daniel. I remember him from Sunday University here in Malaysia.
Thank you very much, Dato. Very kind of you. My name is Daniel Abdurrahman. I'm the Vice President of the Oxbridge Alumni Society currently.
I did not know that, by the way.
Okay. And I'm representing the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute. Now, if I may say that, I would be remiss not to mention that the greatest affront to human dignity is currently happening before our eyes in Gaza. Hunger, famine, diseases, denial of humanitarian aid perpetrated by the Zionist Israeli government. Despite this and ICJ pronouncements, as well as those by various UN and humanitarian agencies, the affront to dignity continues. And I know while we've spoken about many positive things and so on, quite many great examples, my question is sometimes many of us feel very helpless. So my question to the panel is, what can we do at an individual, communal, and national level to give these people who are not getting their dignity, dignity? Thank you.
We start with Cole. You spoke about the SDG God just now with the 17 attributes, 17 sifat. So maybe from Geneva.
Well, yeah. Needless to say, this is one of the most acute problems, and however we felt on October 7th or 8th when things that first started triggering this happened. I mean, the ongoing outrage is really very problematic, and the idea that you can't have a that you can't have a peace or broker a peace because that would be giving up and letting the Hamas win or whatever. I mean, we're way past some of those issues. Now, the difficulty is in part a political one. You know, you mentioned the World Court decision and so forth. I was talking to someone just before we started today, and one of the difficulties is some of these things. I mean, the decision saying that the occupation of Palestine was not lawful, and it's an opinion that goes back to 1967. So this is not something new. This is a huge problem, and it's escalated. It's taken on probably worse dimensions than any of us can remember in our lifetime, and yeah, it may be worse than the debt problem, although I suspect it will end sooner than the debt problem. I have no instant solutions. But I think we need to find ways to remind, and I think there are powerful voices within Israel. There are powerful voices on all sides saying that this really needs to be brought to an end, and we need to find a solution that will respect dignity.
Let me say something about the second part of your question, which is how do we avoid hopelessness? What can we do in our own little place? Let me share a story. So there was a Christian congregation that was trying to move a big grand piano from the chapel into another room. And there was a lot of discussion because it was very heavy and it was very hard. And there was a lot of ideas that were shared. And finally, a very elderly man in the congregation said, "Let's gather around the piano and lift where we stand." And I love this little image of lifting where we stand. Each of us feels quite powerless. Each of us perhaps is quite powerless, or at least most of us. But there is something each of us can do. And what we need to do is identify what that is for us. For me, as a law professor, it's working in an academic lane, and so it's trying to work as an academic. For a religious leader, it's going to be slightly different. For a student, it might be slightly different again. But I love this idea of each of us doing something to lift where we stand.
Thank you.
Can I also perhaps, developing the theme from this morning, share a story? And I think many in this room will be aware that in the United Kingdom, from where I come, in recent days, there has been unrest and rioting and looting on the streets of many cities, the cause of which is not entirely clear, but in many opinions, it's not unrelated to the Gaza situation. And I heard on the BBC a woman living in the city of Sunderland in the north of England talking about the rioting that had taken place the previous night and how this had been an enormous shock and disruption to the community. But what she wanted to focus on was the hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers who had taken to the streets the next morning to repair the damage, to rebuild the broken walls at the mosque where rioters had crashed them down. And she said, "I'm doing this because as a member of the community of Sunderland, I want our city to be known throughout the world for peace and for love and not for the outpouring of hatred." So it may be an easy answer, and it's not meant to sound trivial, but what matters more than anything else is that we continue a respectful dialogue. Because if we retreat into entrenched positions and stop speaking, there can be no future.
Indeed. Well, right. Well, I mean, it's just sobering thoughts as well. Well, one final question then. The microphone was almost making its way around to the, yes, we have indeed.
Thank you, distinguished panelists, for speaking to us today about human dignity. I have a rather simple question to ask, really, out of the plethora I've come up in my mind. We've heard about people having to work for others' human dignity. So how can the United Nations or any formal or informal organization help improve human dignity globally if there are countries unwilling to listen and these countries restricting much access to human dignity, but with, I think, the reason being behind this most likely being due to fear. So how do we solve the problem of fear itself, especially to help all these people?
Thank you. No conflict of interest, but it's guy's wearing a mini UN tie there from Abingdon School. This is a schoolboy, by the way, question, so a warning there, Brad. Cole.
So one of the things I agree with, part of the problem of polarization is a problem of fear. And that is one of the things that we have to wrestle with. You know, I think my sense is we look for places where we can lift where we stand. We look for practical things that can be done. I'm conscious, like in the G20 context, we're focusing on things like trafficking. This is a huge multi-billion-dollar issue, but we need to find practical ways to cut off some of the problems, to identify some of the supply chains that seem to make this scourge continue. So that's an example of an area where their impact is possible. The issue on finding solutions to sort of debt issues at macro levels, but also having that trickle down. I mean, I think that's very significant. Dealing with extremism, with hate speech, again, we can do what we can to counter that when we encounter that in our own lives or our own communities. There are no easy answers, but I think we need to find sort of large institutionalized ways of responding and smaller micro individualized ways of responding as well.
Thank you, Cole. Mark?
When a young person stands up and says they have a simple question, it normally means there's an impossible answer. So I think nothing fuels fear more than ignorance. And for a lot of people, it's indifference or ignorance that motivates their actions. So for your generation, you need to engage in the most active dialogue as possible with people who are different from you, because it's learning and exchanging experiences that dispels ignorance, dispels indifference, and brings communities closer together. So do what you can. Our future is in your hands.
Yeah. The last word, Brad.
And I would just emphasize what Mark said earlier about United Nations Human Dignity Day. It's not an end in itself. It is something we hope to create, and then it will be up to us to do something with it. So it's a way of creating an occasion, as Mark described it, a symbol for focusing our attention so that in our various spheres of influence, we can remind and amplify the message of human dignity.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Mark. And indeed, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, alas, all good things must come to an end. But we are, of course, you know, in summing this up, I can think of in the Muslim tradition, we have to learn to rise from above fear over to love. And as His Royal Highness said in his speech, in the face of fear, we need to spread more love. In the face of ignorance, we must spread more knowledge. And I think this is a wonderful context in which we want to end this royal session. And we are, in fact, as His Royal Highness mentioned earlier as well, the fact that we have in our audience, you know, His Eminence, the Bishop of Kuching, somebody who, in fact, you know, in the face of the fears of the community and what he actually did for his community, there is an example where we can all particularly learn from. You know. So we're very proud, Bishop, that you know, at least you've provided us with a Malaysian examples across His Highness's global examples there. Wonderful. I mean, Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the end of this royal session. Please let us all give a very, very warm Malaysian thanks to our panelists. Thank you.